Join us on a journey where we unravel the latest trends, tackle your burning questions, and explore innovative strategies that are shaping the future of compensation, all with a cup of coffee in hand. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Comp and Coffee. As we kick off the new year, we wanted to focus on what some of the latest research data is telling HR and compensation leaders right now. There's no shortage of reports, particularly the number of prediction emails I know I'm getting in my email box at the moment. But knowing how to interpret them is probably the part that feels a little bit overwhelming. So we're hoping to unpack that a bit today. So today's conversation, I hope, is going to be about translating insight into direction. We're going to look at what HR systems research reveals about confidence, trust, and decision-making, and how compensation research connects those insights to real pay strategy. My guests today are going to approach the topic from different angles. The through line is how leaders can use research to make better, more defensible decisions in uncertain conditions. So without further ado, I'm going to have my two guests introduce themselves. First of all, Stacey Harris, first time on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. I've obviously been a long-time follower of the survey. Would you like to introduce yourself? Tell us about all that you do.
Sure, yes. And thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to have a chance to chat with you and the team here. I'm Stacey Harris. I am a Chief Research Officer and Managing Partner at Sapient Insights Group. We are a women-owned research and advisory firm that focuses on HR and business systems and how they get used inside of organizations from a process and a technology and an implementation and a use perspective. I've been in the space, though, both as a practitioner for many, many years before I went into doing research, and I've been a research for over 15 years now. That number keeps getting longer and longer. At some point, you're like, oh, I've been a researcher for a very long time. But we've run, underneath my guidance, one of the longest running HR system surveys, which is the one that we'll be talking about today in the market. It's really over 28 years. I did not run it for all 28 years. It was run for the first 17 years by Lexi Martin. Many people might know her and her brand and what she did for our industry for 17 years. But I took it over almost 15 years ago. And now it's in its 28th year. And it's really is the sort of vendor neutral, focused on voice of the customer survey of what's happening in the market in this space. And so we had over 10,000 participants last year, which was pretty amazing because that almost doubled from where we were at the previous year. I think everybody data is the conversation whenever you're in uncertain times. And so very excited to be here on the conversation today.
Great to have you here, Stacey. And listeners, I think there's one way you can always recognize someone from Sapient Insights at any event you go to. It's because they always wear bright pink. And I'm very pleased. I know we're a podcast, but maybe you'll see some of the images of us on LinkedIn, on social, but Stacey is staying true to brand and she's got bright pink on today. So I'm
had to go search for it before the call. Yes.
All right. And then Amy Stewart, welcome back to the podcast. Always love having you on. Do you want to say hello to the listeners and tell them what you do here at Payscale?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ruth. Yes, my name is Amy Stewart. I am the manager of the content and research team here at Payscale. So I help author our compensation best practices report, if that's something that you have read before, which is our flagship report that comes out in Q1. So we're very excited about all of the insights from that report and also hearing about all of the insights from the Sapient report on HR systems.
Great. Thank you. Welcome back, Amy. So, Stacey, you've obviously been studying HR systems, we've said, for over 2 decades. What was it? Was it the 28th this year?
Yeah, it's the 28th year that we've got data sets from, which is always, my bet is that probably the only long, because we used to be, there was a couple other in the industry, some big consulting firms that had some research that was a little comparable, but I don't think anybody now is, I think they've all kind of stopped doing some of their surveys. But I bet you there's some comp surveys that's been around as long as that, if not longer, right? So.
And obviously, Amy oversees the research function here at Payscale, and Payscale themselves have been doing compensation research for over 2 decades. So you're in for a treat, listeners. So let's dive into some of the conversation that we wanted to have today. So one of the things we wanted to think about is the question's not just what the data says, but how leaders should interpret it and decide which signals deserve attention. But Stacey, I'm going to start with you. From the HR systems survey this year, what are the most important signals you are seeing right now, and how HR and compensation teams are feeling about tools, vendors, and decisions?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a tough year, right? I think both for vendors and for buyers as well, right? A couple of the things that we saw, which, I I like to put pretty terms around them, but it is really, we're really seeing sort of an economic realignment that's happening in the market, right? And what that means is that we had been on sort of coming out of COVID, there was a lot of sort of ups and downs, and depending on what industries you were in and what regions you were in, as far as overall numbers. But one thing that we saw this year loud and clear from questions we asked about what business initiatives are driving decisions being made in your organization, because that always should drive what's happening on HR, is that over 40% of organizations told us that they were planning to increase revenue numbers, so grow rapidly, right? That's a pretty big number to get 40%. And then 70% said at the same time, so you're figuring we kind of asked for a top three, right? And so one of the top two was always one of these three things. Didn't matter size, region, or industry. The other 70% basically, or the 70% told us that they were doing some cost-cutting processes, either reorganization, optimization, or they were literally going through efficiency processes. And then we had, that was a list of like 16 different things. There was a lot of other options they could have picked, which would have been AI, which would have been sort of mergers and acquisitions, would have been globalization. But those were the two that just came up over and over again. And what we realized is that, particularly for HR professionals and comp in particular on the sort of latter end of that, is there's this pull happening between I want my company to grow and I want you to reduce costs at the same time. Now, a lot of people think it's all AI. That's not really the case. I think it's a industry sort of resetting is what we're seeing in the market. For HR professionals, that means they're being asked to sometimes do downsizing while they're actually increasing roles in certain areas, right? Or they're being asked to deal with attrition and let attrition sort of reduce their workforce numbers and not hire more to replace them, and then figure out how to get the work still done. And then for a compensation person, what we're seeing is that they're being asked to, if not freeze salaries, to adjust salaries, to really think about where the company's going more than where it's at. So AI salaries are like tripling, quadrupling, we're seeing in some cases, right? Where other salaries are staying pretty stagnant. So those are the things we're seeing happen in the market that's really driving a lot of conversation right now.
And I think, I mean, obviously, Amy and I, we look at it from the compensation lens. I think how we're seeing that play out is the realization, not a new realization, that, compensation is often one of the largest costs within an organization. And that proving ROI on that, or the link to how that's driving business growth and value, has been something that's become very much a focus this year. Amy, from Payscale's more recent research, what are the compensation trends that you're seeing that maybe align to that, especially when we've got budgets that are tight and expectations are high?
Yes, that is a huge question, and we publish a lot of research at Payscale that answers that question in a lot of detail. Again, our 2026 Compensation Best Practices report hasn't come out yet. I do have some of the numbers that I can share in a little preview
Love early
today
signing.
in the podcast. So, we're really excited about what we're seeing in the report, but I would agree with Stacey. It's a year of uncertainty, resetting, and strategic alignment at like that macro level. We have a spotlight section this year on AI, and I think we're going to get into that in a bit more detail in the technology section of today's podcast. I would say one of the hottest like comp specific topics right now, especially at this time of year, is pay increases, because that's what's happening with performance reviews, with trying to figure out how are you going to retain those workers? You're asking to do more with less. For every single year, it seems like it feels like that. So those efficiency questions are really driving a lot of that. How do we retain people? How do we engage people? How do we make sure we're growing the business without overextending and overspending, particularly on talent? Because that is, to Ruth's point, one of the biggest cost centers for a lot of organizations. We just released a preview of the Compensation Best Practices report called the Pay Increase Preview Report. So if you want the pay increase numbers, those are available now. We are seeing that the average is staying flat at 3.5% median for pay increases. We also found that 44% of organizations said that they are giving or considering peanut butter pay increases in 2026, which was an interesting thing to discover. We last saw that in the Great Recession. We're not currently in a recession now, but there are signals that feel similar. There's a lot of organizations, again, trying to do more with less and trying to weather out what feels like a storm, even though it's kind of an unusual situation. We don't think that peanut butter pay is necessarily a best practice for rewarding and retaining top talent, but there are reasons why organizations might take that approach, and one that they are considering for this year for a lot of reasons. The labor market favors employers. So to a certain extent, they can get away with it because a lot of talent is job hugging right now. They are not seeking new opportunities because the job market is so risky. And whenever you leave a job for a new company, you become one of those employees that becomes at risk. If there are layoffs because they have that sense of keeping their older folks and letting their newer folks go, if there is some kind of a recalibration that takes place within an organization during a tough time. So a lot of employees are staying put and they're not asking for raises, they're not asking for big things. And so some employers are taking advantage of that during this time. But we also see that there are investments that are being planned to retain and engage people because that's important too. You don't want your top talent to leave. And organizations that want to grow do have to hire in certain roles. So making sure that you're getting compensation correct, giving merit-based pay increases where it is warranted, or if you're not going to give merit-based pay increases, to do other types of rewards to make sure that you are retaining those people so that you can combine them with total rewards, with long-term incentives, with other types of things that will incentivize your top performing workforce to remain with your organization, to feel valued, to make sure that they are being part of that like larger vision for your company and doing the good work that they need to do to make sure that your organization is going in the direction that you want it to go. It's always a balancing act. Gosh, there's so much in the report. Another report I would say is pay transparency and pay communications. That's huge this year, especially with the EU directive. I think a lot of organizations are still behind where they want to be when it comes to pay transparency, and they're particularly behind where they want to be in communicating about it because it's a big piece of the legislation that I think needs more attention. It's not just we are in compliance, but it's how are we making sure that employees understand the changes that we've made and how that is benefiting them and how it's benefiting the organization as a whole.
Great, thank you. So I think if I was to listen to both of you, cost containment, efficiency, and how to drive growth are probably, although you're coming at this from slightly different perspectives, is the commonality maybe there. Do you ever see, Stacey, I'm interested to know, leaders overreacting to trends versus potentially missing quieter but more meaningful signals in your data?
Yeah, it's a really big issue, right? We see is whether it's overreacting to trends or overreacting to what's sort of in the news cycle at the same time, right? So a really good example is layoffs, right? Like I think if you would have asked anybody in the end of last year, they would have said like everybody's laying off, the whole world's laying off, right? Like they're like we're just seeing it all over the place. Our data actually showed 52% of organizations were planning to increase their workforce instead of decrease their workforce next year. But when you looked at enterprise organizations over 5,000 employees, that number dropped to like 42%. So we're seeing a slightly higher percentage planning to decrease their workforce in enterprise organizations, which makes it feel bigger, right? I think
Mm.
because it's from bigger companies, it's obviously bigger total numbers. But when you really look at it, what we saw was really interesting, and people were missing this note, which to your exact point is that if enterprises are laying off and mid-market and SMB are not, and they're actually doing more hiring, we're seeing some of that top talent shift from big enterprises to mid-market and SMB organizations because they're more affordable now, right? Because they're looking for different incentives. They're looking for options to maybe work more flexibly. They're looking for opportunities, right? And so we are seeing a really interesting talent shift towards that SMB and mid-market, which is a crucial time because right now AI is making those organizations more flexible so they can act more like big companies. It's very similar for those of us who went through the dot-com bubble. All of a sudden, small companies looked really big because they had good talent and they could look big because they were on the web. AI is doing that very similar thing for a lot of mid-market and small companies. So it's sort of an interesting sort of mixed signal if you're not watching, right?
Yeah. So great insights from both the research. But one of the things we want to explore here is it's only useful if it helps you make a better decision. And I think connecting HR system insight to compensation strategy and what we're thinking about doing in compensation is really important as well. So, Stacey, coming back to you, based on your research, how do you think HR leaders should use the insights from your survey to evaluate whether their technology is actually supporting better compensation decisions in 26?
I bet you Amy will probably completely agree with me on this. One of the things we say about our data is it's a starting point. It's not an ending point, right? It should be looked at as a place to start the conversation. So especially if you're doing benchmarking, you should never say, oh, I need to reach this. It should be, how does this fit into the strategy we have? This is a starting point for our conversation. I think the other thing is I always tell people have 3 data sources. Make sure you have something that validates that it's not just my data source, it's maybe 2 others that actually say the same thing. That gives you a sense that it's not a shot in the dark. That one of the things we look at is, can you look at year over year trends going up or down? So the longitudinal is really important when you're looking at data. But I think when you're looking at our data, I think particularly what you should be looking for is not just sort of understanding what it's saying in aggregate. You should really be looking at it from a size of company, industry, regional perspective. Those make a really big difference in what the data says. And we've known that year over year. We try as much as possible. The aggregate report's a little bit hard. Sometimes you have to go to some of our deeper reports to get to it. But so, for example, this conversation we just had about enterprise companies versus mid-market companies on the compensation side, if you looked at our overall number, only about 40% of organizations have a comp system, right, as what we would call them. But when you look at enterprises, that jumps to like 70, 80%, right? So if you're over 5,000 employees and you're working without a compensation platform, you're probably working with one hand tied behind your back. Those kind of things are really important. If I'm mid market and I am waiting to add that to a platform or I'm waiting to invest in that, that means you might miss the boat because they're starting to increase the percentage of organizations who are using a compensation tool. Interestingly enough, we're actually seeing SMBs pick up compensation tools faster because oftentimes they don't have enough people to manage compensation. Like I think the biggest competitor for compensation solutions is Excel sometimes,
Yeah.
right? Well, if I don't have someone who has all those Excel experiences and knows how to work with them and comp background, the tool actually makes that a lot more manageable. And so we're actually seeing faster pickup. It's not higher adoption levels, but faster pickup in the SMB space with compensation tools. So I think it's sort of an interesting mix when you look at data that you have to sort of know where you sit in it, if that makes sense. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. So segmentation is important, which again, I guess Amy applies to a lot of our research as well. But in terms of like the CBPR, obviously you've been knee deep in that, Amy, because we are about to publish that in February. How can that help organizations move from market insight to real pay decisions that they can stand behind?
I think a big theme in CBPR this year and in the compensation management space generally, as we're seeing it evolve and become a more centered strategic aspect of HR, is the confidence piece. How confident are you in the market pricing that you have for the salary offers that you're making? How confident are you in the pay increases that you're giving and the total reward strategy that you have? We ask those questions in CBPR and we see that 60% of organizations say they're very confident or at least fairly confident in pay increases for 2026, 70% for Payscale customers. 60% is a strong number. That's a majority. That leaves 40% of organizations that are not confident in their pay increases. So I think that speaks a little bit to what Stacey was saying also about how organizations are reconsidering or looking at kind of their strategic package, their portfolio, and evaluating what is really the most essential things that we need to both grow and be efficient in the new year. I would like to think that compensation is one of those things because, as we mentioned before, your payroll is your biggest expense in your organization. If you don't get those numbers right, if you don't get the compensation offers right, you put yourself in a position where you are having to fix challenges later in order to have, you might have pay equity issues, you might have a talent attrition issue, you might have an inability to get sign-ons from folks. We saw a lot of organizations really struggle during the Great Resignation of 2022 over the comp issue because there were these wild offers being flung at people just to get people in the door. And although we're in a reverse market now, I think the desire to be very, very strategic and accurate about the salary offers you're making is still there. It's just in the other direction, and that can switch at any time. So I think making sure that you have that eye on what is equity within our organization, what do rewards look like within our organization, how is that strategic, is incredibly important. I think having the right tools to do that is a good bet to make.
I think obviously I've read the draft of CBPR, I've obviously read the HR and the Sapient System Survey, HR System Survey. We're going to include the link to those in the show notes, everybody, so you can take a look at those. I think my piece of advice would be, if you're the comp person or even if you're the HR person, is don't use them in isolation on your own. I think, from the HR system survey side, now is the time to be partnering with your other C-suite kind of colleagues when you're thinking about overall HR tech strategy. And the same for compensation. Compensation isn't something that should sit within HR. If you are going to really use it as a strategic lever, it's got to be a C-suite conversation. It's got to be about how you connect comp to business results. So that connectivity, I don't know, is that something that you're seeing, Stacey?
It is, and it's interesting. So compensation is one of the number one metrics sent to the executives and the board level if we have a board level inside of organizations, right? So it gets there anyways, no matter what. And if you don't put a story to it, they'll put a story to it, right? So I always tell HR professionals, make sure you're on top of your comp numbers and your comp data and make sure you have the explanation for it, because if you don't give the explanation, they're going to make that explanation in their heads. I think the other side of that, sort of when we talk about where budgets are heading, we know, and I think we'll get into this when we get into the AI conversation probably soon, is AI is driving the desire to have sort of a cross company looks at everything. And not even so much that it has to be all one platform, but that they want AI to be able to sort of jump in and access information in different systems, which means we have to have more open sort of pathways for all of that, right? That is then driving CEOs to basically look to CHROs, CTOs, and CFOs, the three, to be sort of spearheading how that looks across the organization from an AI perspective, which is leading IT to increase their ownership of all tech budgets, including HR. So we saw a 40% increase in IT leaders owning the HR tech budget. Now, that doesn't mean CHROs are losing their spot at the table. It doesn't mean they're becoming less strategic. It just means they're sort of being asked to sort of think more broadly about their role in the company and that data that goes across the company. And I think that gets to what you were just talking about, Ruth, which is you really have to think at an enterprise level, not just about servicing your business units, but how does this data service sort of the bigger conversation that we're having? And that really gets you back to that executive conversation, right?
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so let's pivot into that technology discussion then, because we've got a few more nuggets to unpack there. One of the themes that we see across all the research is that trust is increasingly tied to technology, and leaders want tools that will help them move faster while also helping them to explain those decisions clearly and fairly across the organization. So, Stacey, from your perspective, how are buyer expectations changing when it comes to HR and compensation tech? What separates vendors that build trust from those that don't potentially do that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that we're seeing. One is there's sort of, we're seeing sort of and our data has looked at this for a long time, but I do think that it is becoming more critical, is that there's a difference between sort of the user experience, whether that's an admin user experience or a end user experience. So even in compensation tools, oftentimes it's very much centered around the comp analyst role, right? But there is generally sometimes a manager view or an employee view to some of that data set. And so that user experience is becoming a bigger catalyst for not just the tech itself, but how does it integrate with the other things in my company, right? On the other side is that vendor relationship conversation. So what we're seeing a lot of organizations think about what we call platform clusters, which is the all-in-one and the point solutions. They don't want to hear that conversation anymore, right? They oftentimes are much more focused on trying to find partners who will work together well, right? Like I've got a big system and I've got some systems that support it, and I want to make sure that the data flows evenly and they're partnering together and they partner with me so that my data is kind of going from cluster to cluster inside of my organization. Those two things end up being really important. So for example, we had talked about the fact that we do a user experience and vendor set for all compensation platforms. Payscale got 6 of them, I think, this year, if I get the total number correct. 5 in the sort of user experience and vendor stats and the vendor satisfaction ratings, and 2 number ones in mid-market. And I think, and it was for the different solutions. So that's because you guys have multiple solutions that you offer to the market. I think leveraging that insight as to the difference between what is the customer saying versus what are the features and functionalities is a big conversation we're seeing the organization make in the market, right? Which is customers have a perspective and they need to understand that. I think the other tech conversation that we're seeing in the market is that AI is a conversation, but it's not a driver. It is, people are getting very savvy about the use of AI and what it can accomplish inside the organization. When you talk about trust, AI is a big conversation in that trust. Can I trust the data that it's putting forward? Can I trust access to it? Can I trust that it's going to give the right answer to my customers and to my employees and to my support staff? And so I think AI is a great opportunity to increase performance and increase operation work, but it is also something that is being looked at very carefully inside of organizations. Is there a risk value? So I'm doing a risk judgment as, is this a place I feel comfortable being able to use AI? And if not, why bother? Because I'm getting good answers anyways out of my tech. So we're seeing a lot of that go on in the decision-making process, right?
Yeah, and that definitely plays out in the compensation sphere, Amy, isn't it? People concerned about the role of AI in market pricing and helping to make trusted pay decisions. Do you want to talk about that and what you're seeing?
I certainly can. Yes, the role of AI in the compensation space is a huge trend. Exploded onto the scene in 2023. It made this big splash. But I think we're just now starting to see organizations start to practically grapple with the implications of AI from a business management perspective, as opposed from like a I'm going to personally play around with this to write emails for me perspective. And so we're getting a sense of what it can do and also what its limitations are. So everything feels different now than it did 2 years ago. But I think it's important to note that when we talk about AI, we're not just talking about generative AI. 2 years ago, generative AI came onto the scene. But we've had machine learning, we've had recommendation engines, we've had RAG. We've had other things that are AI related for longer. And Payscale has been doing things with AI for longer than other vendors in our space. So, as a, layman's terms, AI is what happens when Netflix recommends you like another show based on a show that you've already watched. So this is a different type of thing than trusting ChatGPT to spit out salaries for you and the offers that you're making to employees. I don't think any serious vendor is advocating for that. What we are seeing is that there is opportunity with automation, with machine learning, with predictions and trends, with ways to surface insights where AI can take a lot of the burden off of the analyst and allow them to do more strategic thinking because those parts are done in the back end with the tools. So we talked a little bit about spreadsheets before, Stacey, and I think it's going to be a market in the future where spreadsheets are really going to struggle to compete, especially if you're using aging data as your primary methodology for setting pay in the future. I just don't think it's going to be accurate for where the market is heading, particularly when you consider how disruptive AI and AI related skills are going to be to jobs. So you start thinking about like, hey, this job that we've had in this company for 20 years, say a project manager, the skills we're looking in that job in 2 years might be different than they were 10 years ago. So adding the aging data just to try to figure out that benchmark may not be accurate. AI can do a lot of the things the human mind just can't. It can reference multiple data points. It can do that simultaneously. It can extrapolate estimates. It can infer trends. And you can do this with technology to fill the holes for when you're pricing jobs when data is low. And I think that that's going to be a huge boost to organizations that are looking to those hybrid roles or those niche roles or those jobs with those special added skills. That's where AI can really, come in clutch to help you figure out a market pricing strategy. Obviously, it requires guardrails. We can do more with it, but we do need to have a human mind to make sure that we are understanding where that data comes from, that it's a validated data set, that it comes from HR trusted sources, that we are putting some additional thought and analysis and strategy behind what we are doing. I don't think it's a push button kind of exercise. It's still very strategic, and it requires people who really understand compensation in the space already to know the decisions are correct. And that comes back to that confidence piece that we mentioned before.
Yeah, I think that's kind of really interesting. I think both of you were touching on some of the things. We also had a discussion before we started the podcast about the impact of AI, and what we've both been seeing is potentially organizations opting not for a platform, but to build their own, because now it's so quick to potentially build your own. And I can imagine, some chief technology officer saying, well, it'll be a lot cheaper if we just you're doing Excel now, let's just build our own. I think some of the things you touched on there, Amy, around trusted data, because we know from some of our other research around like looking up salaries on ChatGPT is like not a great idea. And guardrails, and then most of these platforms, which you may not realize are embedded with expertise, and the AI that's being layered into those platforms are really just building on that expertise and learning from that expertise as well. Stacey, probably AI, I mean, is it going to be like a massive disruptor to what we see in the HR system space?
It is, but I think in a little different way than what we think it is, right? So I agree. So we already saw 80% of our HR professionals tell us we're already using AI at some level in our personal life. Kind of, Amy, you had mentioned it, right? Like that we're rewriting job descriptions, we're using it, and only about 14% of them are paying for it. Only about 30% are getting their company paid for. So about 60% are using a free version. And HR people are smart. They're not idiots. They're not going to put PI information inside of a free ChatGPT. but they are going to maybe put out job descriptions. And what people don't realize is the metadata that organizations can get off of. Like they can see, oh, you've now looked at job descriptions for an AI person, a role for maybe someone doing bioscience, someone doing generative tool sets. I now have an idea of the kind of hiring you're doing in the company. You didn't even have to say it, right? Like it's there because it's in the metadata. So there's a little bit of that I think people are going to probably learn the hard way eventually, is that all that data is being scraped at different levels. But I think the bigger issue is that, we see right now about 8%, we're really about across the market, we're at about 24% of organizations saying they're using AI on a regular basis as an embedded HR process. And what that means is that they are using it some way in a professional way that they feel is appropriate for their company to make decisions off that data set, right? From an AI perspective. And I mean, a very good point in the fact that there's a difference between generative AI and general machine learning. We ask about both combined and we always get pushback. And when we ask it, the first year we asked it before sort of generative AI was as big as it was, we had this number that was sort of slightly inflated, or at least was higher than we got the second year. And what we realized is that people were sort of putting their own spin on it when they saw AI now. They're like, oh, it's the thing I'm doing on ChatGPT. And so that actually dropped our number slightly because they weren't thinking of machine learning. And I think it is important for them to realize there's a lot of machine learning behind almost every tech in the market right now. But I also think people have to realize that the open technology that is generative AI that is out on the market, to your point earlier, Ruth, it was built originally on a open internet system, which meant that people were not protecting their data as well as they needed to or could have, because they didn't realize sort of the amount of work that was happening around scraping all of it, right? And it didn't seem like such a big risk. As we've gotten over this last couple of years and people realize the value of their own data, the value of the information they have, we start to see people close off access to that data set, which means as good as something might have been in ChatGPT 4 years ago because the data was really fresh and nobody had put it behind a firewall, now their data may not be as fresh because it's not validated. I think the word validated is going to become really important in almost all of our language when we think about data sets. Is when was it last updated? When was it validated? How much bias is built into it? How much training have you done on it? And the other piece of that conversation is that we're already starting to see lawsuits from, there's a bit of most recent one with the talent intelligence tool. Now, whether that will change any of the laws, regulations, we'll see, but lawsuits from end users saying, I don't want my data used to make decisions around my compensation, my hiring within the organization, what opportunities I get. If you're getting that data from a source that I haven't approved and or validated, right? And that's the open market scraping. And so that again is going to impact what something like an OpenAI ChatGPT can do or can access. So again, I always tell people to really vet the data set. The tech itself isn't really as important as the data set behind it. And I think that gets back to what you were talking about, Ruth, which is that inside of platforms, they are more taking that AI against their data set, which they've already validated. They've been validating for years, right? And that is probably the most curated and probably the best example of being able to trust data inside of a platform. But I do think that organizations are still unsure of how that is sort of connecting to the generative AI tools. And vendors have to be more open about how those connections are working.
And it's ironic because most tech companies now are data companies, whereas 10 years ago would have been, I've been around long enough to know, so the data has now become such an important part of the conversation. Well, thank you both for joining me today. We always get to ask like a bonus last question. So Stacey, my bonus last question for you is, if HR and comp leaders remember one thing for them to take into 2026, what would that be? What would be your recommendation?
I think the one thing that HR leaders need to be advocates for data. I don't say that lightly, and I think we've been talking about it for a long time, but this really gets to the conversation we just had, is they need to be advocates that we are using solid, validated, fact-based data sets in the decisions that we're making. And that will make them advocates for AI. It will make them advocates for business goals. It will make them advocates for better compensation and equity and trust, because what we're seeing in the market is a lot of hype and a lot of, oh, my friend from X, Y, and Z said, or I'm seeing off of ChatGPT. So when we just go back to the data and the facts, we're going to get better answers. And I think if HR really hones in on that, they will be in a better place at the end of the year. So my focus is they really have to focus on data.
Right. And Amy, same question to you. What would you say, like one thing from, maybe let's do CVPR, one thing, or whatever you want, any of your like garage of research that you have, and there's a number of cars in that garage. What would be your one thing that you would recommend that they remember?
I would say this year that change is constant and it's accelerating. So the market is always moving and it's always going to move more. And I think it's going to move more rapidly in the next few years. So compensation management needs to get more strategic, needs to be more integrated, it's going to be more complicated. And for that reason, it needs to be more automated. You need to get out in front of where we're headed versus where we were or where we are now. We're not going to yield back to a time when compensation was this back office function where pay decisions were made based on old data in the spreadsheet without any transparency whatsoever. Compensation is recognized as a strategic lever of the business. We're seeing that increasingly right alongside HR. And that means more investment is needed to make sure that those pay decisions that you're making are fair and defensible.
That's great advice. Yeah, I would second all of that. I mean, I think the pace of change that I feel I've experienced this year, just in terms of like overall development of AI, understanding AI, and then how we're putting that into our roadmap. You just think if that's going to double in speed next year and the year after, it's like, it's going to be very interesting to sit here in 12 months' time and say, wow, like this is what happened last year. So, well, thank you both very much. Thank you to Stacey Harris and to Amy Stewart for helping us make sense of the data in their research. I hope you've enjoyed the show. So as I said earlier, if you want to dig deeper into the research we discussed, then you'll find the link to the Sapient Insights Group's HR system survey and Payscale's latest compensation reports in the show notes. And obviously, if you're following either Amy or Stacey on LinkedIn as well, because you'll see some of this pop up on LinkedIn. As always, we'd love to hear from you, the listeners. You can email us at coffee@payscale.com. That's coffee@payscale.com, or join in the conversation on LinkedIn. Thank you all very much for listening. And thank you, Stacey. And thank you, Amy, for joining me today.